Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this final sort of day of COP26 at the Cryosphere Pavilion. We'd like to give a special welcome to those of you watching at the hubs in Geneva and in Stockholm. Just to give a little bit of context about today, and then I'll move on to this particular side event. This is the last day of COP26. The negotiations are very much ongoing. The final cover text came out at about 7:15 this morning, and a lot of delegates are currently examining it. One of the things that a number of cryosphere countries have been trying to get in is more mention of cryosphere. There is the word cryosphere now once in the cover text, so that should be considered a little bit of progress. But in a sense, it's still early days in this last day. For those of you who have not followed these kinds of negotiations in the past, what is extremely likely to happen is that the clock will be stopped, and it will continue to be Friday for 1, 2, or 3 days until the negotiators reach a point where they decide that they have a final text, or they need, in a sense, they need, in a sense, to agree to disagree and leave things where they are. There were a couple of points where that's what happened, in essence, in Madrid, particularly on financing. So things will continue here at COP. We will not be sending after this afternoon, but we do have a really interesting schedule this morning, focusing on the need for 50% reductions by 2030 by Cryosphere first, and then presentations by our wonderful volunteer early career scientists following that. So just check out the schedule for the names and institutions and countries. All of our early career scientists are not studying in their home countries. It sort of emphasizes the international nature of especially, I would say, cryosphere science. So this particular pavilion is very much focused not just on cryosphere dynamics, but on how they speak to the need for not just ambition, but urgency. The need to not allow or cause really overshoot above 1.5 degrees because of the way the cryosphere begins to respond at those levels. And we never want to solely focus on the consequences, but on the fact that it is not set in stone, that it is still possible to stay below 1.5 degrees, and that it really is our decision. So this morning, what we have are two presentations. One, we're very honored to have Dr. Joeri Rogelj, who is a multiple IPCC author, coordinating lead author on the emissions pathways chapter in the special report on 1.5 degrees, active also on AR5 and the forthcoming AR6 Working Group 3 report. And he will speak to the science behind that. And then following that, we have Dr. Ryan Wilson of Climate Analytics, who is going to do a real deep dive in what individual country pathways look like, both those that are 1.5 consistent, such as the UK, Germany, Sweden, Finland, and our COP26 host, Scotland, which joined 50 by 30 last week, which we were really grateful to see. And then give a little bit more of the science behind that, because he didn't have time to do so in some of the shorter events, especially last week. So we're really looking forward to getting that level of detail. And I will, without further ado, turn it over to Joeri to talk about the IPCC's work in this respect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pam. I just need the clicker probably to move forward. Otherwise, I'll be stuck here for a very... Thank you very much. So what I want to give you is a bit of a global overview of pathways limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, drawing a bit on the work of the IPCC special report of 1.5 degrees of warming published in 2018, but also linking it a bit to the latest assessment report of the sixth assessment report from Working Group 1 that came out just in August this year. I want to start with kind of the global overview picture of pathways of 1.5 degree pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Here you can see an image of the global carbon dioxide emissions consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Importantly, it says with no or limited overshoot, so less than 0.1 degree overshoot, which basically means that the maximum warming that that is projected in these pathways is at 50% probability, either 1.5 or maximum 1.6 degrees. What do we need to do to limit warming to those levels? Again, the latest IPCC report clearly established it's the total amount of carbon dioxide emissions that leads or that is roughly proportional, or global warming is roughly proportional to the total amount of carbon dioxide emissions that we ever put into the atmosphere. To stop warming, we need to bring our emissions down to zero and limit the total amount of emissions until then within this budget. And so, because that budget is really small, the latest IPCC report indicated for a 50% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degree, we would have 500 billion tons of CO2, 500 gigatons of CO2 carbon budget left. Today we are emitting around 40 billion tons a year. So you can do the quick math. If we would not be reducing a bit more than a decade, and we would have already used up the carbon budget. And that really speaks to the first key characteristic of all these pathways. Any pathway that really tries to be at 1.5 or even just close to 1.5, we see a robust declining trend in the next decade. 40 to 60% below 2010 levels by 2030. Actually now the draft decision text mentions the median value of the IPCC report, 45% below 2010 levels. Despite the range, it is clear by 2030, global carbon dioxide emissions need to be markedly below today's levels. The second key milestone on these pathways is then here marked by B, which is all these pathways reach net zero CO2 emissions roughly by mid-century. And that is then the carbon budget, which is the area under the curve, is then closed and kept within those 500 billion tons that we have. Under the Paris Agreement, we don't only cover CO2 emissions, we cover all greenhouse gases. And if we take those into account and see when total greenhouse gases become net zero, that is not at mid-century, but actually slightly later. You don't see it here on this figure, but it's the last point there. They are achieved roughly 2 decades later. So in 1.5 degree pathways, we have net zero CO2 emissions around mid-century, net zero greenhouse gas emissions around 2070, and in all cases, very strong reductions in the near term, both in CO2 and in non-CO2 emissions like methane and nitrous oxide. Now, how do we make these transformations, these strong reductions in emissions? Without any doubt, this is a huge challenge. And also the IPCC report provides some insights there. This is the cover of the 1.5 degree special report. It says that holding warming to 1.5 requires rapid, far-reaching changes on an unprecedented scale. Each of those words in bold here has a specific meaning for the IPCC and is built on specific evidence. With rapid, as you could see in the previous slide, we mean within the next decade. By starting today, but having achieved significant emission reductions by 2030 is absolutely essential to keep 1.5 degree on the table at all. The second word there is far-reaching. And that means that we really need to see changes in all sectors. We need to see changes, or we need to change the way in which we produce energy, in which we use our lands for either food or fiber or wood production. We need to reimagine the way we move around, the way we design our cities, the way we build our houses. And then finally, we also need to reconsider how many products we use and how those products are produced. And finally, the last bolded sentence there, or word there, unprecedented scale, really points that we need action everywhere. Nobody's off the hook, no sector, no country is really off the hook. If we want to achieve these global emissions, we need to bring with us all countries, both the multinational and the very most vulnerable of populations and societies that are currently still around. And they need to be supported in making this transformation. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to limit warming to within 1.5. Now, what is progress to date? Here I draw from the UNEP emissions gap report that I was a lead author on now for the last 10 years. And in the UNEP emissions gap report, what we do is we always compare where emissions are going, and that are the top lines there, and where they should be going compared to limit warming to certain temperature levels, 1.5, 1.8, or 2 degrees. And what we always see is that there is a significant gap between where we are heading and where we should be going. This visual is still from our report that was published just before the COP, but actually on Wednesday, we published an addendum. The figures are not updated, but the numbers change a bit, so I will tell you how they changed. In any case, this image shows that there is an important gap between where conditional pledges or where the pledges or the NDCs are heading and where we should be going to limit warming to 1.5. We find in the most optimistic of cases, we find a 25 gigaton CO2 equivalent gap. Now with the new announcements that have been made in the past week, including new NDCs by India, by China, also the announcements, the sectorial announcements in terms of emissions in methane, transport, coal phase out, this gap could be slightly further reduced by a couple of gigatons, but still an important gap remains between where emissions are heading and where they should be going. So finally, then, the question is, can we actually make those emission reductions? Without any doubt, those reductions are extremely ambitious. So the question is, are these actually feasible? And the IPCC was asked this question in the special report and came back with 6 dimensions of feasibility, 6 tick boxes that need to be ticked for us to be able to say that something is feasible. And some of those tick boxes, we as scientists, we can tick and we can confidently say that this is feasible. And these tick boxes are geophysical feasibility, whether it's possible within the laws of physics and chemistry to limit warming to 1.5, we can say that's absolutely possible. Whether it's possible within the carrying capacity of our planet, whether the solutions can be actually implemented, we can say that it is also feasible from a scientific point of view. We know that we have the technologies to do this, basically, to a large degree. And we also know that it doesn't really cost the world. It's the investments required are actually relatively limited compared to the important benefits that we would get. But then there are 2 boxes that we as scientists cannot tick. And that is social and cultural feasibility, whether we as a society are able to change our behaviors and change our and make the behavioral changes that are required to achieve those deep emissions reductions, and then institutional feasibility, whether implement the necessary change or the change necessary to achieve those emission reductions. And there we actually are looking to this forum here, both to society, but particularly to those negotiations rooms and to the governments sitting there to make sure that these 2 boxes of feasibility for these deep emission reductions are effectively ticked. And with that, I hope I was able to give you a short overview of what 1.5 degree pathways imply. Of course, could dig much deeper in sectors, in regions, and so on, but unfortunately, I don't have more time for that. I don't know who is next up. Okay, is he online? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Ryan, sorry, I think you are muted. Ryan, sorry, I think you're muted. I don't know if you can hear me. Ryan, can you perhaps please remove his screen? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, not this one. Sorry, we're just trying to reach Ryan. Because he's screen sharing, he might not be looking at the video. That might take a few minutes. Okay, I think we might have to kick him out from StreamYard. I think that might be the only way. Nick, yeah. Yeah, we can do that in the meantime. See if you have time. You have time? Oh, we'll do that. Okay, thank you, Joeri. If you have any questions while we fix Ryan's issue with the microphone, now is the time. And please ask the questions from there. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Joeri.
Thank you very much. I use this cake plot quite often.
Yeah.
But I do not go that far to say the economic part is kind of cheap. I rather think that the economy has to change in its roots, else we would not be able to do all of that. So how do you see this economic issue?
Yeah,
It's the economy which causes the whole thing. So
that's true. It's indeed the economy that causes. I think I'm very well aware of the various lines of thought there between decarbonizing our current economy, making sure it pollutes less, or changing the economical paradigm. What I'm also aware of is that implementing a new economic paradigm within the timescales that we have available is something that I think is highly unrealistic. So I think we need to work, if that is something one wants to pursue, we need to work on both avenues simultaneously, slowly reinventing our economy, while also making sure that what we are doing today becomes increasingly less polluting, actually, and drastically and urgently less polluting than what it is doing today. I cannot imagine ourselves to reinvent a new economic system within the next decade, to and reinvent it within the next decade and achieve the massive institutional and regulatory challenges that are needed to reduce those emissions over 10 years only. So I think that is a bit that I struggle with seeing how this can really lead to to achieving the urgent emission reductions that we need today.
I agree, but I do not see how we can reach the 2030 targets without changing the economy. So it's probably going to be in a crude way, but else we would lose the game.
I think we see very good trends in how both the economy can be decarbonized and also how different countries are starting to put not only emphasis on growth, on GDP growth, but really try to value other aspects. Maybe not yet to the degree necessary or required, but at least that thinking is starting to permeate in countries. I agree, not sufficiently, but just an example. Even China is currently already accepting to reduce or limit its growth targets in order to address environmental concerns. And I think that is important. Maybe not yet sufficient, but at least the thinking is there, and I think there is a change already happening. The question is whether it's quick enough
and strong enough.
So I don't know how we are doing with getting Ryan with sound onto. Not yet. Okay, good. Any other questions? No questions? Yeah, please. Oh, yeah.
Good morning. I'm Guillaume Herman from Marine Scotland Science. I agree with the gentleman about what he said about the changes required about the economy, but I agree also that the institutions in place are too strong to make such massive change required. Personally, do you believe that this is achievable?
It's a really good question, and a question I get asked a lot. So my research looks at both sides of the coin. In my research, I show what should be done, and I think with the changes that I have also seen over the past decade, the changes in perception, the change in prioritization, I do think societies can change very rapidly if we are willing to do so. The other side of my research looks at where we are heading. And I know with what is currently on the books, but what we are currently doing, we will never limit warming to 1.5. So it are these two things. I have no expertise to say, and I don't think anyone here has expertise unless they have a crystal ball, to say whether we will really live up to the challenge. Limiting warming to 1.5 is extremely challenging. Then again, 1.5 is not a strong cliff. If we limit warming, if we fail to limit warming to 1.5, but we manage to limit it to 1.6, that is an equally very valuable achievement. Or 1.7 or 1.8. All of those are unimaginably better than just cruising through 1.5 to what we are currently have on the books is 2.5 and more degrees by the end of the century, and still further increasing. We have not yet reached net zero in those pathways. We have not yet stopped adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So I see both sides of the coin. I think I have no expertise or no crystal ball to say whether it is feasible. I just know that if we put our minds to it, a lot of progress can be made. Yeah, I think that person was first, but then, and I'm just waiting until I get an answer. So I'm just here.
My name is Maxence Menton. I would like to ask you a question as one of the early career scientists here. What would you advise us to do to help to go in this direction at the right scale?
Well, as I said, or as I presented, nobody is off the hook. No sector is off the hook. And importantly also, this is not just a question of behavioral change, changing a few things in our lives. It is a question of systemic change. So I think there are things you can do in your own life, which are important. Energy efficiency, being critical about your diet, being critical about how often you take a plane compared to a train, what kind of energy you use, maybe invest in house insulation and so on. But fundamentally, what is really important is to make sure that those in power, those making decisions on your behalf, know that you care about this. Also, not just those in power, but make sure that those around you, even when if these are sometimes difficult conversations, either your family, your social circle, know that you care about it and know what you're doing about it. And I think this is a way to really ensure that there is societal understanding, but also a societal drive and momentum towards for politicians ultimately to make the undoubtedly hard decisions and large decisions that they have to make to make any transformation to 1.5 or 2 degrees, to be honest, reality.
Thank you. But like as early career scientists, we do have a little bit more of knowledge about the climate science, and I would like to know if we can have a role in this, maybe the communication or I don't know, as ambassadors about the climate science as well.
Yeah, as an early career scientist, there's many ways in which you can contribute to ensuring that the knowledge you have, the expertise you have, not just in your narrow field, but also just more broadly because of the education you had in this broader area, is communicated both to policymakers and to wider society. I mean, you can go to schools, primary or secondary schools, and provide them and give talks. There's lots of resources available online as well to help you in communicating this kind of sometimes complex concepts to a 10-year-old. Another way to get involved in or to provide, so that is kind of externally to the general public. The other way is to get involved in the IPCC. And you can get involved there by, first of all, already volunteering as an expert reviewer. The drafts are being put out. If you're an expert, you can apply to be a reviewer. If you have a couple of papers in this area, you will be accepted. And you can start contributing to making sure that the best available science is in the IPCC reports and then ultimately reaches this forum. So there are a couple of ways here, both public facing and then directly towards this forum through the IPCC. Are we good? How? Okay, we continue. Ryan is still no. Yeah, you can go ahead. Sorry, I mean I'm just filling up, but
Can you hear me?
yes, perfect.
So following on the economy side of the conversation, I do agree that there's change has to be constructive in the systems that are already in place because of the urgency and the lack of time to make huge change. But I think a big part of this COP for me has been realizing that there's some economic incentives that don't apply to other sides of climate change impacts that aren't related to the 1.5 goals, but maybe to loss and damage and other things where maybe investors don't have incentives to invest in those things because they won't get returns. And in those, so maybe to get to the 1.5 goals, the economic side of things will suffice, but maybe other parts of the impacts will not. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, some thoughts there, but obviously my expertise is in pathways. So these are just thoughts not based on my core research expertise, but it is absolutely true that it is much more interesting for investors to invest in new technologies where they can make money, even so low carbon technologies that will scale a lot, that will contribute to the solution and where they can make money. It's much harder for investors to invest in adaptation measures, and it's well established. Already it's also clear about in the numbers we see of where finance is actually going. Mitigation projects much easier to finance than adaptation projects. So the only thing I can say here is that if not of interest to the public, to the private sector, we really need to be innovative in either how to make it interesting to the private sector or just have the public sector make sure that those investments that are critical, I think particularly in adaptation and resilience, that these are made. Maybe that means a redirection of the focus of where any public finance is directed. It's maybe just creating the enabling conditions for investments in mitigation to happen, and the private sector can take that over, while then really focusing on making sure that the adaptation investments are also made. Again, just some reflections without it being what I really study. Thank you.
So my question is related to this, to your personal reflection on if it's possible or not. How much do you think that this conference influences your optimism or pessimism? So if this is like, if there's no real outcome of this, would that mean that you would reconsider everything basically?
No, I wouldn't reconsider everything. I mean, it is clear that what comes out of this conference will, to a large degree, decide or determine whether we will be having any chance to limit warming to 1.5. But what comes out of this conference is not only the pledges, is not only the announcement of net zero targets and so on, which I think is quite encouraging. I mean, they're just promises now, they're just announcements, but that's also logical. That's the logical order of first having announcement, then needing to go to the national level to make strategies, plans, and start implementing it. So we're far from there. But even in the UK, I think the net zero target was adopted in law in 2019. Only this year, they actually came out with a strategy to how they are actually going to do it. So even here, where they have a committee on climate change, they have very strong institutions to help make that decision and make that progress. Even here, it took several years. So it is clear that also in developing countries, in India, for example, it will take a while until we have a clear grasp on how they will be doing that. So that is one thing, these pledges. On the other hand, there's also talk, and if you look at the draft texts that are out here, to look at kind of accelerating the ratchet cycle, allowing countries to come forward, or urging countries to come forward every year with updated or with strengthened pledges. I think that is also an important signal that that the countries here in these negotiations accept that what is currently on the table is not sufficient, and that there is a process to accelerate. If they accept it and they just wait until 2025 to have new pledges, well, by then it will really be too late. Already now, it will, with what we have on the table, with what we see on from what the implications are of that, we already need to be at the lucky side of climate sensitivity and so on to actually still limit warming to 1.5. But as I said before, even if we limit warming, if we actually manage to bring our emissions down to net zero, and at that point we end up with 1.7 or 1.8, that is a huge achievement, and that is infinitely better than anything where current policies are currently pointing us towards. Once we achieve that, we can consider whether we want to try and slowly reverse warming with more carbon dioxide removal. But that's a controversial thing. First things first, we need to get to net zero, CO2 particularly, as soon as possible, to limit that peak warming, the maximum warming we will ever experience. Yeah, or yeah.
I apologize, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Georg Kasser, University of Innsbruck, and I'm a cryospheric and atmospheric scientist. And as such, I'm quite nervous to hear that you even, I agree that 1.5 is not a sharp target, but pushing it to higher levels is something which makes us cryospheric scientists extremely nervous, because we don't even know whether West Antarctica is remaining stable within 1.5, or it's starting to go with 1.3, or the rainfall on Greenland summit is just an occasional happened once and never again. The coastal erosion, including methane exhalation in the Arctic, where the Arctic Sea, you know about that, yeah. I wouldn't talk too much about maybe we should go or accept also 1.678 or whatever.
Yeah.
I think 1.5 is the absolutely upper limit, and we should even go try to get, as you mentioned, get down very, very urgently, whatever the definition of a tipping point is, but we are extremely nervous about it.
I share your nervousness, but I think we both also share the understanding that 2.5 degrees would still be much worse than 1.8. I honestly also don't think that 1.5 is necessarily safe. I think it's the absolute best at this stage that we could still achieve. If I look outside over the past couple of years and I see the kind of impacts that we have seen in highly developed countries, we have seen floods destroying old town centers in Germany and Belgium. We have seen heat waves in US and Canada really disrupting public life. These are the most developed regions in the world that are totally unprepared to what we are currently experiencing. Just imagine what is actually happening in Africa and India, in least developed regions. So I'm also absolutely, even besides the cryosphere, I'm not sure that 1.5 is a safe limit. I just think that, I'm not there to shift the target. The target is to keep warming well below 2 degrees and to continue pursue to limit it to 1.5. I think that is really what we should be aiming for. I just want to highlight that even if we would fail to limit warming to 1.5, 1.6 is the next best thing, or as close to 1.5 is the next best thing, and we should just be try to be as ambitious as possible, and even as ambitious as is currently impossible, but we just need to try and achieve it. So it's not about moving targets. It's about making sure that we keep in mind that we want to limit the maximum warming, the peak warming, to as low levels as possible. Because as you know, in the cryosphere, there are also path dependencies. Even if we would be able to reduce warming again in the long term, there are legacy impacts both in sea level rise and in cryospheric melt that will still have happened, and that will have a long time legacy over multiple centuries. So it's really not just the level after an overshoot, but it's really the peak warming that we want to limit to as low levels as possible.
Yeah, thank you very much.
How are we? Okay, one last question, and then then I thank you for assisting me in filling this.
I don't know whether I can keep this on whilst I talk. Thank you for the answering these questions. And I just wanted to pick up on that point about the cryosphere.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. I'm Paul Behrens from the University of Leiden. I work in industrial ecology and wrote a popular science book on climate change. Just on that point about communication. So we're talking about the 1.5, and it was a really interesting exchange that you had there. What more could be done at the sort of major levels through the IPCC process, also to bring out the cryosphere uncertainties and the large-scale sort of energy transitions or energy shifts around the world? Because I think there's a lot of focus on those temperatures and not a lot of focus on the exploration of communicating the exploration of those potential cryosphere impacts. So I'd be interested in your position on, could you weight the communications a little bit more towards these issues that the gentleman before was just talking about? Thanks.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, this really focused on what the IPCC can do.
IPCC can do, but also as us as scientists to really focus on, I think, impacts rather than temperatures. There's a temperature blindness. We're talking. I mean, I know that's really important, but there's, also focus on these impacts.
So I fully agree, and I think it was a bit of a blind spot in the past, but I think actually the sixth assessment report of Working Group 1 has made a shift there. we highlight both that some impacts scale directly with the warming level, but also that other impacts would be irreversible, and these are particularly the cryospheric impacts and sea level rise as a result of that, where we see a long time, a multi-century legacy of impacts based on past temperature changes and past still over the last century, and so the ones that we are still causing. So I think it's starting to be there. We also had a report on oceans and cryosphere, where also that is taken up. But I agree that now people are looking very much at those temperature levels, and they sometimes forget that what we are actually trying to achieve is we try to avoid impact. We don't try to hit target. We don't try to hit 1.5 or hit 2 degrees. We really try to avoid to keep impacts to as low levels as possible. And I think that is a communication challenge because impacts are much more diverse. So I think it's a really a challenge for communicators that know local context to translate this to the impacts that will be felt for a certain country, even for a certain community. And there we rely on the many communicators that are there to make that translation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for the question. Thank you for all your questions.
Okay. Well, I apologize for the technical issues before, but let's give this another crack, shall we? Just put this into shared. Yep. So while it's great that Joeri gave the sort of general global picture for 1.5 degrees, we also need to look at the national level what countries need to be doing to be 1.5 degree compatible. So today I'll be looking at that for cryosphere relevant countries in particular. And it's important to have these pathways so that we can gauge whether countries and their contributions are aligned with the Paris Agreement's long-term temperature goal. So just give a quick rundown of the talk today. First, a quick introduction to these downscaled 1.5 degree model pathways. We'll take a look at some national level results. Then we'll take a look at what it would mean to achieve the highest plausible ambition as defined by a recent project that was done by Climate Analytics. And then put these results into an equity context as well. So just a quick introduction. How do we get these 1.5 degree pathways? Well, we downscale them from global or regional integrated assessment models, or IAMs. And we're interested in particular in economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions pathways. Now, IAMs use socioeconomic and climate data to produce global scenarios with emissions pathways that correspond to various temperature ranges, but in particular, we're interested in these 1.5 degree compatible pathways. On the right, you see this full suite of pathways that is from the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. And it's possible to downscale these to the national level using national energy data and socioeconomic projections like GDP and population growth projections. So what we do is take this full suite of scenarios, and we filter out those that are considered to have an unsustainable level of carbon dioxide removal. So for example, biomass with carbon capture and storage. And then from the remaining pathways, we take the median to the 5th percentile, so the most ambitious half. And this is then the 1.5 degree compatible emissions range for each country. So just to look at some national level results then. Climate Analytics has a briefing upcoming that was worked on between both us and ICCI. It covers the subarctic countries of Scotland, Sweden, and Canada. And it outlines emissions ranges for various temperature outcomes for each of these countries. And then it highlights where the country's targets and policies are either falling short or where they are actually aligned with this 1.5 degree compatible range. And then it also places in context of projected localized cryosphere impacts. So zooming in at the national level, I've led with Scotland here because Scotland is an example of a very high ambition country. Their 2030 target of 75% below 1990 levels is one of the strongest in the world, and their 2045 net zero target is also world leading, and especially so given that their emissions, projected emissions from the land use change, and forestry sector are expected to be positive, which means, unlike some countries where this is a sink, if being positive, you then need to go even further with the other sectors of the economy. You have to work even harder to achieve that net zero target. So you can see here this blue line that has been modeled by the recently updated climate change plan from Scotland, and it includes sectoral emissions reductions. It's a fairly detailed emissions projection, but what's missing is to see where current policies are at now, and to see what the gap is that would allow Scotland to get onto this blue line to then achieve the 2030 target. But if it is to get on that line and continue that trajectory, then well and truly it would be on a 1.5 degree compatible trajectory. And I thought it'd be useful to compare Scotland with the UK. The UK is often touted as a global leader on climate change action, and indeed they have a number of ambitious targets and policies as well. But just to really show how ambitious Scotland's targets and policies are, you can see that 2030 target is substantially higher than the UK's. The net zero target is 5 years earlier. The target for achieving emissions-free heating in new buildings is 1 year earlier than the UK. And the target to achieve an emissions-free rail network is a whole 15 years earlier. And importantly, just recently, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, recently called for an end to oil and gas exploration, which is something until this point that the UK government has been unwilling to do. So going to the second of the three countries in this upcoming briefing, Sweden, which is a 50 by 30 coalition member. It's also has a 2045 net zero target, which, as you can see there, is in the green 1.5 range. But what's missing from Sweden is an economy-wide emissions target for 2030. So there are sectoral targets for the transport sector and for sectors that are not covered by the EU's emissions trading system. But in terms of allowing comparability and to be able to gauge whether or not that target is indeed 1.5 degree compatible, you really need an economy-wide target. That's something that Sweden should look at as a matter of priority, and that would require, based on this range, it would need to be at least 56% below 1990 levels, excluding LULUCF emissions. And so, as you can see, these current policies, the projection emissions under current policies are still a long way off this green range. It's sitting between 2 and 3 degrees, which is where warming would get to if all countries made similar levels of effort. And while Sweden has released a number of planned policies in their National Energy and Climate Plan, they haven't quantified the projected impact of these policies. So what's also needed from Sweden is a quantification of what the impact those policies will have, and to really gauge whether or not it will get them on that 1.5 range there. And then the third of the three countries in this upcoming briefing, Canada, is a country that's recently updated its targets and planned policies. You can see there that updated target, though, is still sitting in the 2 degree range, and the planned policies slightly still even above the target. So this recently elected government, I'd say, now has a mandate to go further and really make sure that those policies and the target is in that green range, as is the newly legislated net zero target, which is quite an ambitious one, and yeah, is well and truly 1.5 degree compatible. But it's not enough to be there at the end. You really need to follow that green range, because if not, if everyone were to do the same, that is how we blow our carbon budget. So yeah, really important to make sure the whole emissions trajectory is in that green range. Germany is another country that has updated their targets and proposed policies recently, bringing forward their net zero target by 5 years. And that 65% target sits on the edge of the 1.5 and 2 degree range under these model pathways. But with this likely new coalition that's just been elected, it's really a prime opportunity to not just align with this 2030 target, but surpass it and make sure its policies are really, or emissions are really sitting in that, well and truly in that green range. And so the last of the countries we'll look at, it's unfortunately a country that's not so close to the 1.5 degree compatible range. Its target sits there on the overlap between 3 and 4 degrees, which is where we'd get to if everyone else made similar efforts. And their policies basically are not projected to really reduce emissions. At the moment, sitting right at the top of that 4 degree range. So a long way to go for Poland, both the target and the policies. A coal phase out announcement was a good start, but 2049 is far too late, and that needs to be brought forward. And there is analysis that shows under a business as usual conditions, this could be achieved as early as 2035. So a lot still that can be done for Poland. So let's pivot now to this idea of the highest plausible ambition. And this comes from a recent climate analysis of the EU 27 and 9 of its member states. It's the 1.5 degree Pathways for Europe project. And what we did was downscale 2 methodologically distinct, technologically feasible scenarios that have very large emissions reductions for Europe to 2030. And then that is sort of how we defined what the highest plausible ambition would be to sort of meet in this range of these 2 scenarios that really have some of the deepest emission reductions to 2030. As you can see, the EU's updated target and policies sits considerably outside that range. It would need to be at least 65 up to 79% below 1990 levels, excluding LULUCF. And so this downscaled regional results, they were then used to further downscale to the national level for those 9 countries, which includes 4 cryosphere relevant countries that we'll just take a look at now. I've included Denmark here as it's sadly the only country that was covered with a target that did meet this highest plausible ambition 1.5 degree range. But even with Denmark, the policies are still lacking considerably. And again, you look at Sweden, policies are well and truly up there, and without that economy-wide target, it's not possible to gauge whether the target is compatible or not. And then again, looking at Germany and Poland, you can see now on the left, with this range, this highest plausible ambition, now Germany's target sits outside of that. So if it were to achieve that, it would need to go further, a minimum of 72% to get in that 1.5 range. And then Poland, under the previous modeled results, would need to go to around 50%, but under this different framework, it would need to go even further to at least 65% below 1990 levels. So now I'll just put these model pathways into an equity context, which is really important whenever we look at these modeled results, because they don't incorporate these equity considerations. So you can see here on the right, these are different conceptualizations of how you can gauge equity. And somehow we need to be able to account for these to be able to quantify what, in particular, wealthy countries that do have a historical responsibility for emissions and higher capability to act would need to do to then be contributing a fair share. So what we've got here, there's different ways you can do this. There are a few different platforms out there that seek to quantify this. And I've chosen the example of the climate action tracker here. It's a very prominent one, and I've used Germany because that is a climate action tracker country, and we can compare it with these model pathways that we saw earlier. You can see there on the right, this 1.5 degree fair share range, which is in fact negative at 2030. It's far lower than what this 1.5 degree domestic model pathway result is. And that difference between the green range on the left and the fair share range on the right, that would need to be made up by contributions to global climate finance. And so while it's sort of a first step for countries to make sure domestically they're doing enough to fall in that green range with their domestic emissions, but it's not enough. In order for us to really be able to meet that 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement, wealthy countries then need to go beyond that, beyond what they're doing at home, and really step up and contribute enough to those global climate finance efforts. Yeah, so always very important to keep that in mind when we're considering these things. And I think that's it. I'll hand it back over to Pam.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for this very informative presentation. Really appreciate it, and thank you for coming back. Do we have any questions in the room for Dr. Ryan Wilson? Any questions online? No. Okay. Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for this presentation. Can I ask you very quickly, where can we find these reports and all the graphics or the data you have presented today?
Sure. The 1.5 Pathways for Europe project is on the Climate Analytics website. It's also hosted on Climate Action Network Europe's website. And the briefing that I mentioned is not out yet, but it will be released soon. The results for Germany and Poland were in an earlier briefing from last year, looking at the EU 27 and a few select countries. That's also sitting on the Climate Analytics website.
Okay, thank you so very much, Ryan. Have a great day. Our next event at the COP26 Cryosphere Pavilion will be presentations given by our early career scientists who have been volunteering here on week 1 and week 2. Starting at 11:30, we will have Jimena Aguilar Vega from the University of Stirling, who is from Mexico, and Thomas Frank, who is doing his PhD at the University of Uppsala.